Today's guest is Dr. Anthony Chaffee. I was introduced to Dr. Anthony Chaffee through his video, Plants Are Trying to Kill Us, which I've linked in the description below, which he admits is an intentionally hyperbolic title used to outline the benefits of a carnivore-based diet. I really want to thank Dr. Anthony Chaffee for introducing a point of view around diet different from the one I'm familiar with. I've linked all of his socials in the description below, so let's get into it. Dr. Chaffee, thanks so much for joining. I really appreciate it.
Not a problem. Thank you for having me.
I'm so curious about the range of reactions you get to people when you explain what your work is. I mean, I had such a roller coaster of emotions when I started watching your videos and seeing your take on like, oh, maybe there's some plants and vegetables that really aren't healthy for you. And I'm going back to like second grade, seeing my mom like, eat your vegetables, finish that plate.
Yeah. Well, it's generally the classic, wait, you really don't eat any vegetables, but and it's like, well, no, actually they can be actually quite harmful to you. Some of them are pretty mild, but those things can build up. We have certain defenses against plant toxins, and that's why we can eat some plants, but the vast majority of plants will kill us or make us extremely sick. And so the amount of plants that we eat is very small, and they're generally bred from very similar strains, like brassicas. Those are all bred from a single origin. And that's because they have, so they'll have similar toxins. And so we have some defenses against those toxins. So those are the plants that we eat. But just because something has the ability to break down and mitigate some of the toxins that they're being exposed to, that doesn't mean that long-term exposure, even at low levels, is inherently safe. Of course, it isn't necessarily. So if you have low-grade exposure to lead, you can get very serious problems, but it'll just take decades to manifest. And I think the exact same argument can be applied to the plants that we're eating that we were not eating at a prehistorical state in the majority of areas. There are evolutionary biologists who actually point this out. There was I can't remember her name, but she did a TED talk called "Debunking the Paleo Diet." Right. So the traditional paleo diet, the modern named paleo diet, has different plants and vegetables and sweet potatoes, dairy products, things like that. She was pointing out that, hey, look, these things didn't exist 50,000 years ago. The dairy didn't exist 50,000 years ago. The plants we're eating now didn't exist 50,000 years ago. These are all different plants. And so it is actually a very different diet. And that also there's no one Paleolithic diet. People in different areas ate different things based on what they had access to. If you go back far enough, when there's pretty much just when there's an abundance of megafauna around, that was predominantly what people ate, especially in the more northern climates, right? Because there is evidence, there's very hard evidence that humans were living in the Arctic Circle during the ice ages. So really not going to have any plants available then. They would have had to have been pretty much exclusively eating meat. And so that's basically what this comes down to is eating what we've been eating for the longest period of time. There's nothing inherently harmful in meat. There are inherently harmful things in plants, and this is just botany 101. People sort of understand this from a conceptual point of view when you point out that if you run out of food in the forest, you can't just eat any random plant to survive. Most of them will make you very sick or kill you. You have to know exactly which ones are safe that you can get away with, and people do die when they get that wrong. So when you point things like that out, at first people are just like, wait, hold on, what? And then you point those things out, and they say, okay, well, all right, that does make sense. And
because that was my reaction. I was so taken aback by that. Once you continued your speech, I was like, oh, okay, this is actually making more and more sense. And I don't know why I had such a
visceral,
volatile reaction. Yeah, exactly.
Well, it is. We've been. This has been ingrained in our psyche since we were kids. You and I are of the generation that we were brought up. Our parents were like, you have to eat your vegetables. They're the best. And fat's bad. Red meat is horrible. And, so really limit that, and more fruits and vegetables. Our parents and, the generations going back, they would have been sort of that transition period where like their parents would have been, you need to eat butter and lard and meat. That's the meal. That's the real thing. And they have this other stuff on the side, for flavoring, garnish, or maybe you don't have enough meat, or maybe you just enjoy it. But meat and animal fat were very important. And during their lifetime, there's that switch where they started vilifying saturated fat and cholesterol, saying that it caused heart disease, which it does not. And that's another one that people say, well, what about cholesterol? What about this? And you can go through the facts and the data that there is absolutely no experimental data showing a cause and effect relationship between any form of cholesterol, be it total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, SD-LDL cholesterol, or any of the other 100 plus particulates of LDL, ApoB, LP(a), anything. There are no experimental trials showing a cause and effect relationship, and you can only show a cause and effect relationship with experimental data. It's only associations, and sometimes loose associations, which have been later shown to be fraudulent. And actually, they doctored the numbers and left out key points, such as sugar had exactly the same risk increase as cholesterol in like the 7 Nation study with Ansel Keys, which actually should have been the 21 Nation study because he had complete data for 21 countries. And if you include all that data, it doesn't show any connection or correlation between cholesterol and heart disease. So you don't have any experimental data showing a cause and effect relationship. And yet we're saying that there's a cause and effect relationship. You cannot actually say that. It's not a qualified statement. But there are at least 5 randomized controlled trials with thousands of patients that have shown the opposite, that have shown no connection whatsoever between cholesterol and cardiovascular disease. 3 of them showed no benefit from reducing saturated fat and cholesterol. And 2 of them, the larger, more well-designed studies, one like the Minnesota coronary experiment, had nearly 10,000 patients, and they were institutionalized, right? So they controlled every single meal that came to them for years. And they found that replacing saturated animal fats, basically replacing animal fats, because there are saturated fats in plants and there are unsaturated fats in animal fats, but replacing animal fats with vegetable oils and margarine did indeed lower the LDL cholesterol and total cholesterol. But as a result, more people died of heart attacks and strokes. So not only is there no evidence showing a cause and effect relationship, there is direct evidence to show harm by reducing cholesterol and saturated fat. So this is either protective, that animal fat is either protective, or the replacements, the plant oils, which are always said to be the heart healthy option.
Right.
They're detrimental. They're directly detrimental to our health, or that there's a protective measure from meat and animal fat. I think it's probably a combination of both, actually. But that's what the experimental data shows. And because that didn't fit with the narrative at the time, they buried that. So the Minnesota coronary experiment went on from 1968 to 1973. And that was our good friend Ansel Keys, who also doctored and fudged the numbers on the 7 Nation study. Should have been the 22 Nation study. Also should have pointed out that the relative risk increase of sugar was exactly the same as the relative risk increase of cholesterol in those cherry-picked 7 nations that he said showed clearly that cholesterol was the problem.
I think he said sugar's good, empty calories. Was that study?
That's what he said. Yeah. And so, well, he said that a lot during his career. And he said that, well, maybe cholesterol causes heart disease, maybe not, but, why not just take it out? It's not a big deal. Just take out the fat and replace it with sugar, because it's, it's empty calories, so, you just cover your bases, basically, was that argument. And of course, he was on the payroll of the sugar companies. So, and this is known. This is a well-established fact. And so, that you have to be very, very mindful of statements coming from people supporting an industry who is paying them, right? And especially when they don't disclose that, because he wasn't like he was saying like, hey, I work for the sugar companies because I believe in their product or anything like that. Like, okay, fine. And there are people that do that. I mean, there are people that work for different industries. They say, look, I think these guys are doing a great thing, and I want to advocate for them. So, and that's fine as long as you're transparent about it. People can still be a bit suspect. Well, you're on the payroll for them. At least you're talking about it. And when you're hiding that fact,
Yeah.
that's even more suspect. And so, he hid the fact that, or didn't, openly discuss the fact that in the 7 nations that he cherry picked, there was the exact same R values, exact same relative risk increase associated with increased sugar consumption as increased cholesterol. So that's probably an important fact, especially when you're recommending that you replace fat with sugar, right?
Yeah.
And it holds the exact same risk in that say. But again, that's associative. That's an associative study. You cannot prove causation from correlation. And you point this out to people, and then they get really taken aback. And I point this out to doctors, and it's easy for them to look it up, and they go like, God damn it, what the hell?
Yeah.
Because we're taught in medical school almost always, almost invariably, medical school, or nursing school, other sort of medical professions, almost always the entirety of the alpha and the omega of the argument for cholesterol being the causative agent in atherosclerosis and heart disease is the Framingham study, which was quite a good study actually, but it was a prospective cohort study. It wasn't an experimental data, so you can only it's only hypothesis generating. You can only look at trends and look at, okay, well, this is what I think is going on. And then you use an experiment, you change one variable, and then you see what happens, because there are just millions of different variables that go into this. You're following people for 25, 30 years, and you're just letting them do their thing. You're not telling them.
That's got to be the hard part about your world, because there's so many variables entering these studies that I would imagine it's tough to give credit to any one factor.
Yeah.
Solely, like you said, random variable trials are helpful, but it's a super interesting field you're in.
Well, it is, but it's so hard to it's a minefield of misinformation.
Right.
And so you have to be very careful. My father's a physicist and mathematician, and he was he was a physicist at Lawrence Livermore Radiation Laboratory in Berkeley, where they invented the particle accelerator to crack the atoms, and that was Dr. Lawrence, who got his Nobel Prize for that, and so they named the lab after him. My father worked with Dr. Louis Alvarez, who got the Nobel Prize in physics for developing the bubble chamber and cracking subatomic particles. My dad worked on his team, so my dad was one of the first guys to crack the atom and study subatomic particles. So I grew up in a household of scientific rigor.
Yeah. And
so, when I came into medicine, I looked at this, I'm like, this is a soft science at best, but really it's attempting to be an applied science. But my goodness, the scientific method is sorely lacking in the vast majority of studies and applications in medicine. It's actually a shame, but I've come to realize that the majority of dogmas in medicine, and self-evidenced truths. I mean, things that people just say, well, everybody knows this. This is taught in medical schools, and generation after generation. You look back at the origins, at what the original reason that someone made this is why we think X. It's often from a best guess. It's like we don't know what the hell is going on, because there are so many variables, there's so many factors, and someone just came up with a theory that wasn't in competition with another theory. It was just sort of the best guess that you had at the time, and people just didn't challenge it and just went, yeah, okay, sure, maybe.
Yeah.
And then it just grew and grew and grew, and then it started getting taught to future generations of doctors, and then they taught it, and then you just know, well, eating more fiber reduces your risk of bowel cancer. Obviously, everyone knows that, right? Okay, well, where does that come from? Does that come from experimental studies? Well, no, there's no experimental study showing that increased fiber intake reduces risk of bowel cancer. Okay, well, what about observational studies, or look at a large population and study statistics and multivariate, analysis of the different factors? Nope, that's not it either. Okay,
just a game of generational telephone.
Yeah. So where did it come from? It came from a guy named Dr. Burkitt, for whom Burkitt's lymphoma was named. He's a very famous surgeon, and he was doing work in Africa, and he saw that some of these native tribes were having like these large bowel motions, and he figured that was because they were eating a lot of fiber, and he didn't see a lot of bowel cancer in those populations. And so he surmised that this was likely due to the protective effects of fiber. And so he just ran with that. And because he was so famous and influential, people just said, sure, why not? And that's it. It was never verified. They never did any experimental trial, any to look at what this could possibly do, and why fiber would affect that. But all these theories and ideas of, well, it helps with transit time, and it moves your stool out, because if it's just sitting there and it's having this chemical exposure to this tissue that's designed to have that chemical exposure, then obviously that's going to cause cancer and some sort of problems. But then you look at experimental trials on constipation and motility, and you actually see that increased fiber slows down bowel transit, and it takes longer to get out of your bowel. So that's a bit funny. And then the other thing is too, is that why would this? I mean, that's like saying that our stomach acid in our stomach is just too acidic. And yes, some stomach acid is good, but you don't want too much. And we need to micromanage our stomach acid. It's there for a reason, and our stomach is perfectly designed to deal with our stomach acid at the pH that we were designed to have it at, which is between 1.5 and 2, which is one of the most acidic stomachs in the world that you only see in carnivores and even scavenger carnivores that are eating carrion. They're eating dead, rotting flesh. You have to have a very, very acidic stomach so you can deal with that bacterial load. So our colon is absolutely designed to deal with the waste products of our food. That's what it's there for. And so the idea that we're just the normal function of our bowel is somehow damaging us is a bit funny, and then we have to artificially manipulate it to move quicker to go through, or else cancer. There's no actual proof of that. And in fact, like I said, the experimental data shows that fiber actually slows down bowel transit. And so what are we doing here? When you get methane production when you eat fiber, this can cause bloating. This causes a lot of gas, and methane actually directly affects the motility of the intestine, and so it actually slows it down. So you're creating all this methane, and that is actually slowing down the motility, and you're getting more bloating, getting more gas, and it's compounding the issue. So it doesn't really follow. And again, there's no experimental data showing that, but I've probably guessed that probably around 60% of medicine is sort of based on like a best guess at the time. And I see this in practice. You have guidelines that are, what is a guideline? It's just sort of expert opinion. Maybe it's expert opinion suggested to bureaucrats who then change it to do whatever the hell they want, basically, because sometimes we get the experts that'll say, hey, this is what the evidence shows, this is what we think the guidelines should be, and they go have a bunch of bureaucrats go behind closed doors, and it comes out as whatever they want it to be based on their influences and personal desires. And
there
so
aren't like greater safeguards within that system?
Not really. Unfortunately,
Wow.
I mean, this is the thing too, is that guidelines are expert opinion, and we look at the evidence hierarchy. It's like this pyramid sort of thing. At the very tip is something called an umbrella review. You get randomized controlled trials. That's good experimental data. I know you can have crappy RCTs, and so that's not very good. But let's say they're high quality, and then you have like a series of high quality RCTs. You can make a meta-analysis. You can look at all of them together and combine that data to get basically like you did an even larger randomized controlled trial. And that can be very good evidence. If they're bad RCTs, then it's they're not very good. You're not going to have a very good meta-analysis, garbage in, garbage out. But if they're good, and the meta-analysis will be good, and let's say over time you have 10 meta-analyses with high quality randomized controlled trials, different randomized controlled trials. Well, you can do a meta-analysis of those meta-analyses, and you get an umbrella review, which is just the very tip of that pyramid. At the very bottom of that pyramid, basically, there's a lot of it, and it's not worth much, is expert opinion. And that's where guidelines go in, because guidelines are expert opinion. And they're actually I'd probably put guidelines a bit lower than expert opinion, because expert opinion has been suggested to the bureaucrats making the guidelines but it's not necessarily the experts, and also obviously which experts, who, someone hired them and said, no, we're going to pick these experts to make the
Mm.
guidelines. So there's a lot of selection bias there. And then you have those selected, particular experts then submit their recommendations, and then other people who are not experts decide what those guidelines are going to be. So it's actually worse than that, right? But this is what most people hang their hat on. Oh, that's what the guidelines say, and I hear doctors saying that too. I heard one doctor. It was quite concerning, actually. He said that he was practicing carbohydrate restriction for his gastroenterological patients, and he was getting very good results. And his head of department was coming down on him, saying, "Hey, look, this isn't the way we normally practice medicine here." And he's like, "Well, it's all evidence based. Like, look at this and look at this and look at this. Look at all the studies. Look at all these trials. Look at all these things." And his head of department said, "I don't practice evidence-based medicine. I practice guideline-based medicine, and the guidelines say we should do this," which of course is very
Is that a
low.
liability issue? Like, we want to be able to say we did exactly what guidelines suggest us to do.
Yeah, I mean it's CYA medicine, cover your ass medicine, right? So, and when you're first starting out and you don't have like a basis of practice, and you don't have a firm grasp on what you're doing, following the guidelines is probably very appropriate. It's a guideline. It will guide you in a direction. If you don't really know anything better, at least you can try this and you'll be covered, right? So if someone has a bad outcome and you followed the guidelines by the letter, you're protected. It's like, look, I followed the guidelines. This is what the guidelines said, and then we did that, and unfortunately just didn't have a good outcome. I'm very sorry that happened, but I did the best I could. Fair enough. But once you get a bit more expertise, you can move past that. And certainly there are very, very laudable portions of any guideline that will be very helpful to a practice. But
you need that to scale too.
Yeah, and yes, and but the thing is that the idea is that we should practice evidence-based medicine. That what does the evidence show? What does the best evidence show? And the guidelines don't always reflect that.
I see what you're saying.
And so it's interesting. There was a gentleman, and he sort of has the best numbers in America for cystic fibrosis, treating cystic fibrosis. And these are people that can die in their 20s and 30s, very serious. But he has patients in their 60s that are doing fine. And he does things in a very particular way, and he's very on top of it and very strict with his patients. He doesn't allow them to, any wishy-washy. He's like, no, what are you doing? What are you eating? What is going on? And he's very, very, very strict with them because he wants the best outcome possible for them. And this came up in a book called Better by Dr. Atul Gawande, who's a professor of was a professor of surgery at Harvard. I don't know if he's still there, but I think he probably is. Very interesting book. He's done a very interesting author. He's done a lot of very interesting books. And in fact, the first season of Grey's Anatomy, that?
Oh yeah. Yeah, of course.
The first season, like all the medical stories and things like that those were just taken verbatim out of Atul Gawande's first book called Complications, which is a really interesting book. I would definitely recommend people read that. It's much more interesting than Grey's Anatomy. Even if people like Grey's Anatomy, that's where the medical stories came from, almost word for word. And so all the drama on the side is its own creation. But so in Better, he talks about this doctor who treats cystic fibrosis, and he pointed out to the respiratory specialist. He said, looking at the different sorts of things he was doing, is like, the things you're doing, they're not really following the current evidence-based medicine. And he sort of smiled and sort of chuckled and just said, if you follow evidence-based medicine, you'll always be 2 years behind the curve, or sorry, 2 years behind the cutting edge. Yeah, which is true, of course, because people have to, the innovators have to sort of do something new and try pushing the boundaries of our understanding, and then they're the ones publishing on it, and that becomes the evidence base that other people follow. And the guideline-based medicine is generally around 10 to 15 years behind the evidence. So if you practice guideline-based medicine, you are very far behind what the evidence shows. So if you're not willing to test the boundaries and try to see, well, how can we do this better? At least follow the evidence and use the guidelines as a guideline, but then use the evidence to actually have more impact on your practice.
Yeah, that makes sense. The trend that's so fascinating to me is, in one hand, you go from a macro perspective that this really isn't that contra-narrative to what people have been doing for so long, but it's really just within most recent history that it has become contra-narrative.
Very true. If you think about it, so eating a predominantly meat diet, I mean, this is something that we've done for millions of years. That's what all the best evidence shows. And, you know, especially when we're in the Arctic Circle during an ice age, really nothing else to eat. And so if we couldn't gain all the nutrients that we need in the proportion that we need them, people would have died out. They would not have been able to live under those conditions if they weren't able to get their basic sustenance. And you can't just eke out an existence in the Arctic Circle now, let alone during the ice ages.
Right.
And so, I mean, there's just the harshest environments on Earth. You're like, you know, minus 60-degree weather, like in summer, like it's just like that's your life. And you know, could be exaggerating, but I mean, extremely bitter cold year round, right?
Right.
And so you can't just eke out an existence in those conditions. Like you either thrive or you die. And
it's a little more binary than today. You're
yeah,
saying.
it's just like you're either top of the world or you're just dead.
Right.
And so, and we not only thrived, we became the most dominant species that have ever existed. And
Team human.
Sorry?
Team human. Let's go.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. And that's really because of the ice ages, because that forced us to manifest our destiny as apex predators, and that forced our evolution down a certain path that grew our brain, that grew our technology, because we had to figure out how to take down a mammoth that outclassed us in every physical metric, you know. And so we became the most dominant hunters. We're actually termed super predators in some instances, because, you know, there's no other animal that has been as dominant of a hunter. We've hunted every single known animal on land, sea, and air, and done it very successfully. And so, you know, there aren't any other predators of that caliber, you know. So it's something we've been doing for a very, very long time. This is nothing new. The ketogenic diet approach has been used in medicine since the 1800s. It was the only treatment for diabetes throughout the 1800s. Since the late 1700s, that started becoming the treatment for diabetes. Throughout the 1800s up until 1920s, when insulin was found and started to be able to be, you know, produced or put out on the market anyway. It was typically from, I think they had to get it from cadavers at first, but either way, when they discovered insulin and how to get it to people, that was in the 1920s. That sort of changed things. But up until then, it was carbohydrate restricted diets and you know, ketogenic diets. For epilepsy, you know, we used ketogenic diets to stop seizures, people having seizures, especially children. That was for decades. That was the treatment for epilepsy until we found these pharmacological agents that could have a similar result. And then they just said, they just hit the too hard button and just said, just give them a pill. Don't talk to them about diet and lifestyle. That's too hard. Just shove them a pill. That's fine. You know, so it's and there's really the ketogenic diet. What is a ketogenic diet? It's a removal of carbohydrates to the point that your insulin comes down low enough that you start producing ketones. And you can run off your fat tissue. This is why this is very beneficial for.
Sorry, ketones are energy from your stored fat, right? Am I thinking about that correctly?
Yeah. So there are a lot of different sort of, they're called ketone bodies, so things like beta hydroxybutyrate, but there are many others, and they are metabolites of fat, and they're used as energy. And so, you know, you'll still make blood sugar, you'll still make glycogen, but now you'll have ketones as well, and you'll keep your blood sugar and your glycogen very even keel. It won't have these ups and downs like you have in other with other ways of eating. And so, you know, eating as few carbs as you can so that you have low insulin and even keel blood sugar and glycogen, and now you're able to produce ketones. And basically you're just running on your fat stores, because if your insulin's too high, you cannot get energy from your fat. This is why ketogenic diets have been shown to be very effective for weight loss. They've gone head to head with things like the DASH diet and other sorts of diets to improve many different outcomes.
Is this too why like stress or environmental factors make it really hard to lose weight? If your insulin is spiked from environmental factors?
Well, certainly from your food, it's going to spike from the food that you eat. Carbohydrates will spike your insulin. Protein will give it a bit of a bump, but carbohydrates really jack it up.
Got it.
Fat does not affect it at all. And so, yeah, but then stress, absolutely, because cortisol will raise your blood sugar as well and make you cause insulin resistance. So your insulin will have to come up, your blood sugar will come up, and it will be difficult for you to burn fat. You'll tend to store fat, especially around your central adiposity, so around your stomach, your gut. You get that spare tire, and visceral fat. So you'll start storing fat inside your abdomen around the organs, and that's actually quite a bad sign for poor metabolic health. And you can even be quite slender on the outside, but you can have a lot of fat in your abdomen. You can be very sick as a result of that. It's called TOFI, so thin outside, fat inside, TOFI. And so you can have someone who, outward appearance would look like you or I, but then you do like an MRI scan of their abdomen, it's just full of fat. And that would show serious metabolic dysfunction. You also find whenever you find fatty deposits in abnormal places, it's not a good sign. It's a pathological sign. So a lot of visceral fat is a pathological sign. Fat deposited around the organs, around the heart, in the liver, in the pancreas. Again, these are pathological signs. In the muscles, called myosteatosis, and that's something that we purposefully do in the animals we keep, such as cows and sheep. We feed them a lot of grains to get their fat up, but also they get that marbling. They get the fat inside the muscles. That's myosteatosis. So that's fatty deposition inside the muscle bodies, and that's a pathological sign too in humans. You see that as a very serious thing. But we're doing this on purpose to animals. How do we do it? We give them grains. We give them sugar. I was at a restaurant a while ago, and they had a Wagyu steak that they said it was 100-day candy and chocolate fed. I was like, what? But that made it extremely fatty and extremely, very, very high.
Like the Christmas special? What is that?
Yeah, I don't know. But there was a story. There's a news article a few years ago where like a truck turned over and like all these Skittles just like flew out all over the place. And what they were the off looking Skittles from production. They didn't look quite right. They had a fault or a flaw, and so they're like, okay, we can't put these in our normal bag of Skittles. They don't look right. So they sell them to feedlots, and they give them to cows, and they're just eating Skittles.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah, because the sugar causes fatty deposition. Fructose causes fatty deposition, then increases insulin. You get fatty deposition. You get intramuscular fat. You get diabetes, and you get all this fat deposition, which tastes nice because fat is flavor, as any chef will tell you. And so we do seek out the fat. We've always sought the fat. That's why we hunted the megafauna and then cultivated some of the larger animals like the bovine, and then tried to make sure that they were big, fat, and healthy, and got their dairy and would skim off the cream and typically use that. Cream and butter were main staples. Often the skim milk that was left behind from the cream was actually given to the pigs and other livestock to get them to fatten up, because it actually caused them to overeat. You combine grains with skim milk, which is basically just breakfast cereal. You give those to pigs, and that caused them to overeat, and they would just get fatter and fatter and fatter, so you could have more lard from your pig, and again, so that we could have fat, because we need fat. It's actually very important to our health and our certainly to our neurological development for kids. But yeah, so you have this myosteatosis from feeding a cow Skittles and grains and alcohol, Kobe beef, all that sort of stuff. They're fed sake and all that, those sorts of things, or beer. And then we wonder why humans get marbling and fatty livers and all these sorts of things. I mean, we call it non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. We have no idea how people get these fatty livers. It must be because they eat so much fat, right? Except that we again, produce this in animals that we consume purposefully, and we know how we do that in ducks and geese when we're making foie gras, which just means fat liver.
Yeah.
We stick a feeding tube down their throat and dump grains,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
So it's
Foie gras is
not a very good
upsetting.
practice.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not a nice practice, but that's what happens. And so, if you're just doing that to yourself, if you're just, if you're eating
Good point.
you're
Yeah.
just, absolutely fill packing yourself with grains, you're gonna cause that as well. Fructose in particular. I learned that in medical school and in the biochemical portion of medical school. Fructose, part of the metabolization of fructose, one of the byproducts is a fatty droplet that accumulates in the liver. So you actually get this buildup of fat in the liver, just like alcohol, because fructose and alcohol are degraded into the same byproducts. And so you get fatty liver disease from drinking alcohol, but also from eating fructose or from the overconsumption of carbohydrates. And you just sort of have to store this fat in your liver because your liver is sort of metabolizing this and breaking it down. And the byproduct of this is fat triglycerides, and a lot of that gets stored in the liver. And so, it's not very hard to figure out how and why this is happening to humans when we're doing the exact same thing that we do to animals and getting the exact same results.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to be a bit naive to think that something else is going on. And so, going back to how we're supposed to eat is a pretty logical step. When all animals, when they're eating what they've been eating since time immemorial, they are the healthiest. We don't have any sort of misconceptions with that. It's like, well, what the hell does a koala eat? I mean, if you have a koala in the zoo, I'm like, my God, what the hell do they eat? We need to get a survey. We need to do some sort of, study.
Yeah.
It's just like, why don't you just look at what they eat? They eat eucalyptus, right? Cows eat grass. They eat specific grasses. And so they need those specific grasses. And we need specific things too. And all the best evidence shows that we've been eating meat predominantly, if not exclusively, since the dawn of time. And dawn of humanity anyway.
Yeah.
And so,
sorry, that's an interesting, I'm curious your take on, my understanding is like we're into animal husbandry, but then at the dawn of agriculture makes our quote civilizations. We start forming communities around farming, and there are deleterious health effects of just switching to like all grain, like you talked about. But then I wonder, like for the past 5,000 years, so history, there are incredible advances in cities and infrastructure and all sorts of technology. Like, does that narrative track with the narrative? Like, I think of us moving away from animal husbandry so much and hunting and moving towards a fully agricultural society for those early civilizations. Is that something that tracks with your understanding of our diet?
Well, I mean, some people argue that agriculture allowed us to have cities and technology and all that sort of stuff, which isn't necessarily the case. I mean, that's a hypothesis.
Yeah.
But the idea is that you can't have people that have so much that they have time for leisure, or they're always out there hunting and doing things, whatever. They don't have time for leisure, and so they can't just think there and philosophize and look at the stars and think why, and
right, yeah.
but of course they did. I mean, you see all sorts of philosophy and the different mythologies of every culture. They're actually quite profound in many of these, but I mean, there's so many examples of massive civilizations that completely break from that rule. I mean, look at Genghis Khan and the Mongol Horde. That was the largest contiguous empire that has ever existed in human history.
Right.
They were carnivores. They ate horse meat, drank horse blood, and fermented mare's milk, extremely lactose intolerant as a people, and so it had to be fermented. And they hunted. They hunted, in large scale, and they were extremely dominant because of many reasons, but also one of the reasons is because of their diet. They were extremely healthy. They were fighting against these peasant armies that were being fed gruel, had health issues and weak bones, and they were just even the poorest, lowliest Mongol warrior was getting meat every day. And they were extremely healthy. And this is the histories. There's a book called Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World by Jack Weatherford. And he actually has a section in there specifically detailing how much of an advantage it was for them eating meat in the health of their soldiers and warriors. And so they were really on a different level of all the different warriors that they were fighting. Largest contiguous empire that's ever existed in human history, and they had cities involved, and they ate meat. And they just ate meat. They had plenty of time for leisure and war and whatever the hell else they wanted, especially when they became massively wealthy, and they had all this tribute coming in from all four corners of the world,
all of Asia.
Yeah, exactly. So and Europe too. I mean, they were pushing the boundaries.
Yeah,
into
true.
Western
Full
Europe.
Silk Road, right? Yeah.
And so they were. I mean, they were in. I mean, they I think controlled up to what is now Turkey and north. So I mean, it's massive. And they started going into Europe and messing things up there. But they they were running on meat. So I mean, what's the problem? You have in North America before the Pilgrims, really. So before and after Columbus, there was estimated about 100 million Native Americans in North America, or in what is now America.
Yeah.
And sometime that's from 1492 up until early-ish 1600s, just before the Pilgrims came. It was so populated. They're talking about sailors going up and down the eastern seaboard from Florida up to Maine. They said that you could just see massive fires and bonfires all the way up. It was just teeming with life, and they burned a lot of wood. Every night was like big bonfires and things like that. You just see them forever. They said that 200 miles out, there was a count from a captain in the 1500s that you could still smell wood smoke 200 miles out to sea.
Wow.
Right. So it was, a lot of people, a lot of wood, all that sort of stuff, burning wood. And then all of a sudden, the original colonies were just like these little settled pieces of land, and they didn't really go anywhere. It was just like they were, the Native Americans were just like, all right, you stay there, but you stay there,
Right,
we're
right.
around here. And then the Pilgrims came. They wanted to do sort of the same thing, and there's no one. There's no one there, and they all thought it was like going to be just teeming with life. There's no one. And it turned out that shortly before they got there, in previous years before there, some sort of illness, plague just ran through the native population and wiped them out. And it's estimated that about 95% of them died. So there's only about 5 million left on the continent of North America, right? Or at least from America up.
Yeah.
And so, massive differences, right? And then so people never even thought about moving west because there was no room to move west, right? Maybe trade and things like that. But then people started exploring. They started going, okay, where the hell is everybody? Where'd all the people go? And they started moving out west. And first of all, they had some very interesting descriptions. The grasses were so tall that they said you could tie them in a knot over their horse's head. The missionaries, the Spanish missionaries over in Southern California around Santa Barbara, were saying as well that you could have that the grass was taller than your outstretched arm on horseback.
Yeah.
So this massive, grassy fields and everything like that supported these hundreds of millions of bison and large game, which actually then supported the ground. So actually the animals recycled these nutrients and made it more fertile, which is sort of the argument counter to when they say that animals destroy the plant. Actually, they help the plant to make the ecosystem better. But as they were going west, they couldn't find anybody, but they found these massive settlements and cities that were now ghost towns. So they went to a place that a city that is where St. Louis is now. And they found that they didn't have paved roads, but they were so worn with foot traffic and things like that in 5 directions, and these massive trade routes going out in 5 major directions, all coming into this major city that had long houses and buildings and things like that they estimated could have housed 1 million full-time residents.
Wow.
Right.
That's like Rome at its peak. Yeah, early
That's
Rome.
That's Rome at its peak. In Dallas now, right? So it's like,
good point.
And so it was a massive city. Okay, so they had 1 million full-time residents. What were they doing? They ate meat. I mean, there
Yeah.
were areas that had agriculture and things like that, but predominantly, especially in the Great Plains, they ate bison. Now you can take bison and you can dry it, and this is what they did. They would scare a herd of bison over the cliff. They would crash and burn. They'd cut them up. They'd dry out the meat. They'd crush it with the stones into a powder, and they'd render the fat. And there's actually quite a lot of fat in the subcutaneous fat and the abdominal fat. So there is a lot of fat available. And people say, well, the wild animals are very lean. No, that's marbling that you're thinking of. But the subcutaneous fat, if it's a healthy animal, actually does have a lot of healthy subcutaneous fat and abdominal fat. But most people just throw that out. They trim off all the exterior fat. They throw out all the fat in the abdomen around the organs. And then they go, wow, this meat's really lean. Like, yeah, you made it lean, buddy. And,
Right.
Well, also because we've been told for 50 years that you're supposed to, right? And so that was a good thing. Oh, look how lean it is. Yeah, once you cut off all the fat and throw it away. But so they would keep the fat. They would render it, and they'd get tallow, and they'd mix that with the meat, and in a 50-50 mix. And that ended up being actually 2 grams of fat to 1 gram of protein. So it has a very, very high fat, about 80% calories from fat. And that's what they would eat throughout the entire year. So they had one
fat's
big.
What, 9 calories a gram, and protein's
9 calories
4
per
or
gram.
something? Yeah.
It is 4, but you're going to use the majority of your calories, or you're going to use the majority of protein actually as building blocks. You don't even use them as calories in the first place. And then when you switch over to using protein as energy, actually there's a conversion cost, and you actually end up getting about 3.4 calories per gram. So it's actually maybe even a bit more than that. But if you're just looking at that 9 and 4, it's 80% calories from fat. But it actually is a bit different if you sort of look into the details. But yeah, that's about it. And so they would have one big hunt a year. They had food for the rest of the year. So I mean, what do you mean they don't have leisure time?
Right.
And so and there was when you look at it, if you there was a study that sort of looked at if the wealth of a people can be expressed in terms of the amount of time that you spend to take care of your basic necessities, like eating and all that sort of stuff, getting food,
right,
and leisure time, and the rest is leisure time. That if you look at it that way, not just how much money they have in the bank, but how much leisure time do they have?
Because time is the true resource.
Yeah. And so, you're just there, you do whatever the hell you want.
Right.
If that's the metric we're using, then the wealthiest civilization that has ever existed in human history, as per this study, was the Native Americans in the Columbia Basin, in the Columbia River Basin in Washington State, because that had massive salmon runs. It was just like year round. There's just hundreds of millions,
like
of
nature's drive-through.
And they had these weirs and these nets set up. And so all they had to do was just go in and just collect all the fish. They had more fish than they could ever want all the time because it was already set up. They didn't even need to fish and cast a rod, whatever. They were just getting caught in this nets all the time. They're just pulling them out.
Yeah.
They had everything they wanted whenever they wanted it. The rest of their time was completely leisure. So, how are we saying that you had to have agriculture to have leisure time so that you could support a city, so that you could support other classes of people that didn't have to farm, didn't have to hunt, didn't have to do anything? They could just sit there and be a lawyer or be a philosopher, or be a writer. Of course you could. I mean, they didn't have the written word. That helps. If you want to write books, you probably know how to write. But so I don't think that follows. And there are other people that argue, like evolutionary biologists, that argue that that was probably one of the worst things that happened to us was agriculture, and that actually made things a lot worse. A good example of that would be ancient Egypt. You had this big civilization that was propped up on agriculture. They we know what they were eating. They're eating a lot of grains. They're eating a lot of wheat. They were fermenting that into beer. They were pressing the seeds to express the oil. So we're getting pressed seed oils, and we also have their statues. They don't look much like the Greek statues of just ripped Hercules and Theseus.
That's an interesting point. I've never thought about that.
Yeah, their statues actually show men with pot bellies and
Interesting.
gynecomastia, right? And then
Yeah.
you look at the Ebers Papyrus, which is an ancient Egyptian document. It's a medical document. I think it's like 4,300 years old, around there, and thousands anyway. And it actually very clearly describes diabetes.
Hmm.
It very clearly describes the symptoms that one would experience, or that you would see in someone who is having a heart attack and just about to die of a heart attack.
Yeah.
It describes Alzheimer's, dementia, right? And so, you know, that's
Yeah.
not great, for the for agriculture. And when you see the fossil record,
Sorry, Dr.
um,
Chaffee. This is so fascinating. I realize we're a little over time now, but
yeah, that's all right.
do you mind if I just ask you a quick speed round question? I don't want to
Sure,
keep you too much
yeah,
longer.
that's all right.
Um, I've loved all of the people you've referenced in the books. I'll have to check them out. But is there one person dead or alive that if you could have dinner with them, who would it be?
Oh, yeah, probably Thomas Sowell, and he's still alive. That would be a dream.
Yeah,
I would actually love to get him on a carnivore diet because he's in his 90s. He's still publishing books. He published a book on his
is he an
92nd birthday.
economist?
He is. He's a
Yeah.
brilliant economist.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and but he's also a philosopher and a historian. He's just an amazing
Yeah.
guy, and amazing life story. And yeah, I would love to get him on a carnivore diet to give him another 20, 30 years of good health, because
Yeah.
he deserves it for all the work that he's done and just being a good person. And B, the world needs his mind for another 20, 30 years.
Right. Right.
That'd be very good to have him around. But yeah, no, I would love to sit down and have a conversation with him. Yeah, he's amazing.
Well, I'm glad the world has you around, man. And I really want to thank you for challenging my own worldview.
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
thought it was a really healthy exercise just for me, selfishly, just to
Mhm.
like watch your videos and see where I disagree and see why I disagree, maybe more importantly. And it was
Yeah.
kind of just like the shock of it. It's like, oh my gosh, this seems all correct. Why didn't it become more apparent to me earlier? And so it's really
Mm.
interesting.
Oh, good. Well, I'm glad. And that's a very healthy thing to do. You should try to challenge your own beliefs,
Yeah,
because what if you're wrong?
right.
It's important to sort of test that and challenge that. John Stuart Mill, 18th century philosopher, or 19th century philosopher. He had a very great line in his book on liberty that said, if you only know your side of the argument, then you don't know much. If you haven't
Yeah,
heard the opposing side of the argument in its most compelling form, not from your own professors or people that you listen to and who can do a straw man caricature of the argument and say, well, this is their argument and this is why it's wrong, then you really don't know what the argument is. If you haven't gone to listen to the opposing argument in its most compelling form from its most ardent, um, you know, uh, proponent, then you don't even know what the argument is.
right.
And you just heard a characterization of the argument. You said, "Oh, this is crazy. This meat diet is horrible. You're going to get heart disease. Experts say that this is going to kill you." Well, you know what? Other experts say that it's not. Other experts say that eating the other way is going to kill you. And there's a lot more evidence with those experts, because as we've gone away from eating meat, away from eating animal fat, we've become the fattest and sickest that human have ever been in human history. So, the idea that eating less meat, if we're saying that eating less meat, less animal fat, less red meat, all these things were good for you, well, then we should have gotten healthier in the last 50 years, and we have not. We have gotten
Yeah,
worse.
right.
So, that doesn't even fit with the observed phenomena. And so, it is really important to challenge your beliefs, because, we do the best we can, and our parents do the best we can, and we learn what we learn, but it's not necessarily going to be true. There's a saying that gets thrown around a lot. We don't really know exactly where the origins were, but the idea is that it was like a dean of medicine at Harvard Medical School that sort of said this to the graduating class, and said that half of what you guys have learned here at Harvard is actually going to turn out to be wrong. but no one's going to tell you which half because we don't know. Right. So
Yeah.
you're going to have to figure it out. You're going to have to go and challenge and test your knowledge and your beliefs and see what's right and see what's wrong, and then push those boundaries of understanding, to then teach the next generation. And that's what we have to do. We can't just assume that everything we learned in school was right, because it wasn't. And that we just know absolutely everything. I mean, if we knew absolutely everything and nothing was going to change, then why do we redo the guidelines every 5 years? Right? If the guidelines were perfect and they should just be abided by blindly,
Right. Your
they
dad
wouldn't
isn't
need
changing
to
his
be changed.
particle accelerator every 5 years, or the physics
Yeah,
behind it, right?
yeah. And so yeah, and so we're not, every 5 years we're saying, okay, this is how we should treat diabetes, or 5 to 10 years, different for different guidelines. But for cardiovascular disease, or for this or for that, these are the guidelines. These are the guidelines. They change, they adjust, because we understood from the inception that our understanding of the world changes. And so we can't just say, nope, we never examine anything because we just got it all. That was a big mistake. Galen did that. He was a very famous doctor. He was I believe it was Marcus Aurelius, this doctor in ancient Rome. And he was a brilliant doctor, did a lot of experiments. And that was a Hippocratic method. The scientific method is testing and looking and saying, don't just do things just because everyone's done them, but actually seeing what gets results and doing that. Right.
Yeah.
So being on the cutting edge and being your own, doing your own, research as a clinician, saying, okay, what works best? That's what I'm going to do. Right. So if I have the guidelines and they're telling me to give my diabetic patient a whole bunch of carbs and all that sort of stuff, and I see that it's making their HbA1c worse and they're giving these complications of diabetes and they're just getting worse and worse. But then I contrast that with a carbohydrate restriction diet, and their diabetes goes away, and if they come off all their medication, their biomarkers and health improve, and all these other aspects as well. I mean, it would be malpractice to go with the guidelines if you've seen that in front of your face.
Right. You're
And
Hippocratic Oath. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, first
Yeah.
do no harm. And so that was the original Hippocratic sort of way of doing things, not just going by the guidelines, but just going by what actually works for your actual patients. And so Galen was, exemplified that, and he discovered a lot about medicine, but he was very, very full of himself, and probably for good reason. But he said, don't just try to do all this yourself. Don't try to experiment and figure all this stuff out yourself. I've discovered everything there is to know about medicine. If you want to know about medicine, you just study me, just read my works. You don't have to go any further. You don't try to reinvent the wheel every year, right? Fine. There's always good things you can learn from people, but the idea that he discovered everything there is to know about medicine is clearly, a bit fanciful. But people believed it. And he was so influential that for the next 1,500 years, medical education in Europe was studying Galen.
Wow.
Was reading his books and reading his anatomies and following his path for 1,500 years, right? And it was really hard to change that. And it wasn't until people started really sort of pushing against that and pointing out that, hold on a second, he's actually not describing proper anatomical structures here. Because they weren't allowed to, from the church, to dissect humans up until the Renaissance.
Right.
And they allowed them to do that really for the artists, because they allowed like the Da Vinci's and Michelangelo's of the world to dissect humans so they could see actually how the body works together, so they can make more perfect art. And they were amazing anatomists. There's the Michelangelo's David. There's his finger like this. You see his pinky finger is up like this. You see that muscle right there?
Yeah.
He has that muscle flexed on the David.
That's insane.
Right. So they were brilliant anatomists. And that's how, because they were dissecting bodies, and obviously this allowed the doctors to dissect bodies, and now these people were dissecting them, and they could see that these structures were different in Galen. And this guy realized, holy crap, Galen's never dissected a human before. These are only structures that are found in other primates,
Interesting.
Like apes and chimpanzees and monkeys and things like that. And so this guy had done so many dissections on so many animals, including humans, that he actually knew that. And he went, oh my God, Galen didn't do this. And then he started questioning other things about Galen and that was probably 1,300 years after Galen. And so that was a crack in the dam, and he started going like, hey, Galen's not the way. We need to do this ourselves. And he started doing his own experiment, discovering more things, but the entire medical establishment was against him. And he was just like, what the hell are you talking about? Galen is the way. And it wasn't for another 200 years that they actually got away from Galen and actually started doing their own sort of investigation into human biology and physiology. So that's how influential this can be, but it's really important to not do that. You get stuck for 1,500 years in the medical sciences.
So
it went nowhere. There's no advancement for 1,500 years, and so you have to re-examine.
Yeah, didn't medieval they thought like your fluids were out of balance, like your humors, or
that was even more recent than that.
Oh, seriously? God,
your humors and things like that. This is why you call it your very sanguine appearance.
You have too much blood.
Too much blood or too little. And and there's a number of these different sorts of things that has to do with what has this bilious nature, so it had this too much bile in them and all this sort of stuff, and that would change how it was very interesting. But that was the thing too. George Washington, unfortunately, they were just leeching and bleeding him until the point that he died. The guy had a flu
by his own request too, right? Like he kept asking for.
I don't know the specifics, but I do know his doctors kept doing it, and it made a sort of flu that maybe just some a couple of days of bed rest and fasting would have sorted out, but they just kept going and going and going, and after several weeks he just that was it. But he had enough time to put his affairs in order and write out a will and do all these sorts of things. And so it wasn't like a quick, he just got hit hard and crashed quickly. This was a stretched out, prolonged process. But so who knows if he would have survived if they hadn't sort of interfered. But you have to sort of wonder, taking someone's blood away, getting the anemic, while they're going through this is probably not going to help, I would imagine.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, man. This has been an awesome conversation, and just thanks so much for your content and all your work.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. It's been a pleasure. It was very nice to be on here.
Huge thank you to Dr. Anthony Chaffee, and thank you for listening. Be sure to check out his socials in the description below and hit follow, like, or subscribe. Stay tuned for the next episode.